The sovereign crown sat alone in the center of the grand chamber on a pedestal carved from a single piece of crystal that seemed to glow from within. But the crown itself was dark. Completely, utterly dark. No light. No energy. No sign of the power it was supposed to contain. It had been that way for 6 months. Ever since Emperor Theron died. The grand chamber was enormous, built to impress and intimidate in equal measure. The ceiling arched high overhead, so high it disappeared into shadows despite the massive light fixtures. The walls were covered in intricate carvings that told the history of the Ethorian Empire going back thousands upon thousands of years. Rows of seats curved around the central area where the crown sat, enough seating for thousands of witnesses when important ceremonies took place. Today, like every day for the past 6 months, those seats were filled. Nobles in their formal robes. Military officers in dress uniforms. Scholars with their academic insignia. Representatives from hundreds of different worlds across the empire. All of them watching. All of them waiting. All of them hoping today would be different from yesterday. But hope was wearing thin. The crown itself was beautiful even in its dormant state. It was made of a metal that no one had ever been able to identify or replicate. The surface was covered in designs so intricate they seemed to shift when you looked at them from different angles. Symbols in languages that predated the Ethorian civilization. Patterns that might have been writing or might have been pure decoration. No one really knew. What everyone did know was that the crown was ancient. Older than the Ethorian Empire by tens of thousands of years. The Etherians had discovered it 50,000 years ago on a dead world in a system they were exploring. They'd found it sitting in the ruins of a civilization that had been gone for so long there was almost nothing left except dust and the crown. They'd brought it back to their homeworld. Studied it. Tried to understand it. And eventually learned that it chose their rulers. Not through politics or warfare or inheritance. The crown chose based on something else. Some quality that no one fully understood even after 50,000 years of trying. The Etherians called it true sovereignty, but that was just a label for something mysterious. When the right person approached the crown, it would respond. It would blaze with light so bright it could be seen from outside the chamber. Energy would flow from it in waves that made the air shimmer and sparked. It would rise from its pedestal and float to the chosen person, settling on their head and bonding with them in a connection that couldn't be broken except by death. Once bonded, the sovereign gained abilities that seemed almost magical. They could sense threats to the empire across vast distances of space. Could communicate through the imperial networks without any physical device. Could interface with ancient technology that wouldn't respond to anyone else. They became, in essence, a living connection between the empire and the systems that kept it functioning. But for 6 months, the crown had chosen no one. For 6 months, it had sat dark and silent while candidate after candidate approached it with hope and left with disappointment. And while the crown remained unbonded, the empire was slowly falling apart. The Ethorian Empire was vast. Hundreds of star systems. Thousands of inhabited worlds. Billions upon billions of citizens spread across a huge section of the galaxy. Managing something that large required infrastructure that was almost incomprehensibly complex. Communication networks that spanned light years. Defense systems that protected vulnerable worlds. Planetary shields that kept out radiation and asteroids. Trade routes that needed coordinating. Resources that needed distributing. All of it connected to central systems that reported to the sovereign. Without a sovereign, those systems were failing. Not all at once. Not catastrophically. But steadily. Inevitably. Like a massive machine slowly grinding to a halt because a crucial piece was missing. Planetary shields had dropped to dangerous levels across dozens of worlds. Places that should have been protected were now vulnerable to cosmic radiation. To meteor strikes. To the harsh realities of space that the shields had kept at bay for centuries. People were getting sick. Infrastructure was being damaged. Deaths were climbing. Communication networks were degrading. The instantaneous connections that had allowed worlds separated by light years to coordinate were becoming slow. Unreliable. Some colony worlds that used to be in constant contact with the central government were now experiencing days-long delays in messages. It was like the empire was developing communication gaps that grew wider every day. Defense grids were going offline. Automated systems that had protected trade routes from pirates and hostile species for generations were shutting down one by one. Ships were being attacked that should have been safe. Trade was becoming dangerous. Some routes were being abandoned entirely because the risk was too high. The Ethorian Empire, which had been stable for thousands of years, was slowly collapsing. And everyone knew it. Everyone felt it. The sense of crisis hung over everything like a gathering storm. That's why the selection ceremonies had become so desperate. So frequent. So public. 6 months ago, when Emperor Theron died after ruling for 300 years, the process had been formal. Dignified. The most likely candidates from the noblest families approached the crown in private ceremonies with only the High Council present. Everyone expected the crown to choose quickly. It always did. The longest previous gap between emperors had been 3 weeks. But the crown had rejected them all. Every noble. Every candidate. The private ceremonies became semi-public. Then fully public. The requirements for who could approach were loosened. Not just nobles anymore. Military leaders. Scholars. Successful merchants. Anyone with some claim to worthiness. Still nothing. The crown remained dark. Now, 6 months later, the ceremonies were continuous. Every day. Sometimes multiple times per day. Anyone who wanted could put their name forward as a candidate. The requirements had essentially disappeared. If you could make it to the capital world. If you could present yourself to the High Council. If you could make any argument at all for why the crown might choose you. You got to try. Hundreds had tried. Maybe thousands by now. No one was keeping exact count anymore. Representatives from dozens of different species that were part of the empire. Different professions. Different ages. Different backgrounds. All of them approaching the crown with hope. All of them walking away disappointed. The crowd in the Grand Chamber today reflected that desperation. These weren't just the elite anymore. These were common people mixed in with nobles. Young and old. Some wore expensive formal attire. Others wore their work clothes because they couldn't afford anything else. The empire was opening the selection to everyone because nothing else had worked. Today's first candidate was a military commander who'd served with distinction for 50 years. He approached the crown with his head held high, confidence in every step. Placed his hand on the crown's surface and waited. Nothing happened. The crown remained dark. Cold metal under his palm. After 30 seconds of hoping, the commander stepped back, shoulders slumped in defeat. The crowd murmured sympathetically but without surprise. This was normal now. Expected. The second candidate was a scholar who decoded ancient texts that had been mysteries for centuries. Surely someone so intelligent might be worthy. She touched the crown with trembling hands. Closed her eyes. Whispered what might have been a prayer to gods the Etherians hadn't believed in for thousands of years. Nothing. Darkness. Silence. She stepped away with tears running down her face. A merchant who'd built a trading empire that employed millions. Nothing. A young noble from one of the most prestigious families. Nothing. A worker from the shield maintenance crews who'd saved thousands of lives when a defense grid failed. Nothing. An artist whose sculptures were displayed in museums across 100 worlds. Nothing. One after another. All day. Just like yesterday. Just like the day before that. The crown rejected them all without even a flicker of response. Katie Brooks watched from the observation gallery with the rest of the human delegation. She sat between Ambassador Williams and Dr. Hayes, the cultural attaché. Her tablet was on her lap, open to the notes she'd been taking obsessively since arriving on Ethoria 3 weeks ago. Katie was 24 years old. She'd graduated from Georgetown with degrees in xenology and diplomatic relations 2 years ago. Spent a year working in the human embassy on a minor trade world learning the basics of galactic politics. This assignment to Ethoria was her first major posting. She was the most junior member of the delegation. Basically here to observe, take notes, and learn. But she'd become fascinated by the crown. By the mystery of it. By the question of what quality it was actually sensing in people. What made someone worthy in the crown's judgment? She'd read everything she could find about it. Studied every historical account of previous elections. Analyzed patterns in who the crown had chosen over 50,000 years of Ethorian history. She had theories. Probably wrong theories, but theories nonetheless. The crown seemed to choose people who had certain characteristics. Compassion combined with strength. Wisdom that came from experience but wasn't rigid. People who asked questions instead of assuming they knew everything. Leaders who served rather than dominated. At least that's what Katie thought based on the historical accounts. But she was almost certainly missing something. Something the Etherians themselves couldn't articulate even after studying the crown for millennia. Another failure, Ambassador Williams muttered beside her as yet another candidate stepped away from the dark crown. They're running out of candidates. Running out of time. Katie nodded absently, still taking notes. She'd been documenting everything. Every candidate who approached. Their backgrounds. Their accomplishments. Any public information about their character. She was building a database even though she wasn't sure what she was looking for. The ceremony continued. A religious leader approached the crown. Nothing. A reformed criminal who turned their life around and now ran charity programs. Nothing. An identical twin to a previous emperor, thinking maybe genetics mattered. Nothing. This is heartbreaking, Dr. Hayes said quietly. You can see the hope in their faces. And then the disappointment. The crowd's mood was shifting from sympathetic to restless. This had been going on for 6 months. People were tired. Scared. The empire was failing and everyone knew it. How long before the failure became catastrophic? Then something happened that changed the restless mood to shocked silence. An aristocratic noble named Lord Gareth approached the crown carrying equipment. Not to measure or study. To force the issue. The crown needs encouragement, Gareth announced loudly. He'd brought technology designed to stimulate the crown's energy patterns. To essentially trick it into activating. Multiple people shouted objections. The High Council members stood from their seats. Guards moved forward. Too late. Gareth touched the crown with his device and activated it. The crown exploded with energy. But not the brilliant light of acceptance. This was violent. Uncontrolled. Red and angry instead of the golden glow described in the histories. Bolts of power lashed out. The equipment in Gareth's hands disintegrated. He was thrown backward 15 feet, his formal robe smoking. He hit the ground hard and didn't move. Medical teams rushed forward. Guards surrounded the crown. The High Council was shouting orders. The crowd panicked, people trying to leave all at once and creating chaos in the exits. Chancellor Vex, the eldest council member at nearly 400 years old, stood at the edge of the platform where the crown sat today. His voice boomed across the chamber, enhanced by technology embedded in the room itself. The ceremony is suspended. Clear the chamber. Medical teams attend to Lord Gareth. It took 20 minutes to restore order. Gareth was alive but injured and unconscious. The crown had returned to its dormant state, dark and silent once more. The damage from its violent response had been contained to the immediate area around the pedestal. Chancellor Vex declared a formal recess. The chamber needed to be inspected for damage. The council needed to convene to discuss new protocols before the ceremonies could continue. Everyone was ordered to leave except essential personnel. The human delegation was escorted back to their diplomatic quarters in one of the palace's guest wings. But Katie had special permission to stay. She'd been writing a formal cultural report on the selection ceremonies. She'd requested and been granted access to examine the chamber and crown when crowds weren't present, as long as guards were present. Ambassador Williams confirmed she could remain. Just be careful. Don't touch anything. I want that report on my desk by the end of the week. Yes, sir, Katie said. The chamber emptied. Katie was left with just 2 guards stationed at the main entrance. She could see them clearly. They could see her. But otherwise she was alone with the crown. Katie approached carefully. Respectfully. The crown sat on its pedestal, showing no sign of the violent energy it had just released. It looked inert. Harmless. Just a metal object shaped like a crown with strange markings on it. She pulled her scanner from her bag. The device was human technology, probably primitive by Ethorian standards, but it was what she had. She wanted to take detailed measurements of the crown's dimensions and composition for her report. Katie leaned in close to examine an inscription near the base of the crown. The characters were fascinating. Definitely some kind of writing system, but unlike any language database she had access to. She adjusted her scanner's settings to capture higher resolution images. The robe she was wearing was a formal Ethorian style that Ambassador Williams had insisted she borrow for the ceremonies. Human clothing wasn't considered appropriate for formal occasions apparently. But the robe was designed for someone much taller than Katie's 5'4" frame. The hem dragged on the ground no matter how carefully she walked. She shifted her position to get a better angle on the inscription. Her foot came down on the hem of the robe. The fabric pulled tight. Katie felt herself losing balance, stumbling forward with nothing to catch herself on except. Her hand shot out reflexively and landed directly on the crown's smooth metal surface. The world exploded into light. Brilliant, blinding light that flooded the entire chamber like a star had suddenly appeared in the center of the room. The alarms that had been installed after previous failed activations started blaring. The guards at the entrance shouted and ran forward. Energy poured from the crown in waves that made the air shimmer and sparked like an electrical storm contained in a small space. Power flowed up Katie's arm, through her body, spreading like fire through her veins. And information. Oh God, the information. Katie's mind was suddenly connected to things she couldn't comprehend. Networks spanning light years. Systems managing billions of functions. Data streams from 1,000 worlds pouring into her consciousness. It was overwhelming. Terrifying. Too much to process or understand. But underneath the chaos, she felt something else. Recognition. The crown recognized her. Accepted her. Was bonding with her in ways she couldn't begin to explain. Katie stood frozen, unable to move, her hands still on the crown. The light was so bright she couldn't see anything else. Could only feel the power flowing through her and the vast weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like physical chains. The guards reached her and tried to pull her away from the crown. But the moment they touched her arm, the crown's energy pushed them back. Not violently like it had pushed Lord Gareth. Gently but inexorably. Protective. The crown was protecting her. Voices echoed in the distance. Running footsteps. More alarms. The whole palace was probably responding to whatever was happening. But Katie could barely process any of it through the overwhelming sensation of the crown's bond forming. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably less than a minute, the light began to dim. The flow of energy became manageable. Katie could think again. Could see again. Could feel her own body instead of the vast networks the crown had been showing her. She was still standing. Still touching the crown. But now she could feel it. Really feel it. The bond between them. Unbreakable. Permanent. She tried to pull her hand away and found she couldn't. Not because the crown was holding her. Because pulling away would be like trying to tear off her own arm. The crown was part of her now. The guard stood a few feet away, uncertain what to do. Through the entrance, Katie could see crowds gathering. The High Council members were rushing back to the chamber, their formal robes flying behind them as they practically ran. Katie looked down at her hand still resting on the crown. At the faint glow that still emanated from where skin touched metal. At the artifact that had rejected hundreds of candidates for 6 months. The artifact that had just accepted a 24-year-old human junior diplomat who'd literally tripped and caught herself on it by accident. "Oh no," Katie whispered. "Oh no, no, no." The High Council burst through the entrance. Chancellor Vex led them, moving faster than Katie would have thought possible for someone his age. They stopped abruptly when they saw the scene. The crown glowing. Katie touching it. The energy bond visible in the air around her. The chamber fell silent except for the slowly fading alarms. Everyone stared. The moment stretched out. Nobody seemed to know what to say. How to react to something that had never happened before. Finally, Chancellor Vex found his voice. It came out as barely more than a whisper, but in the silence it carried clearly. "By the ancient stars. The crown has chosen." He walked slowly toward Katie, his ancient face showing an expression she couldn't read. Relief? Concern? Disbelief? Maybe all three. It's chosen a human. Katie's hand wouldn't move. She tried pulling it away from the crown again, harder this time, but it was like her hand had been welded to the metal. Not painfully. There was no burning or pressure. Just an absolute inability to separate herself from the artifact. The bond had formed and it was complete. "Help me," Katie said to the guards who were standing nearby looking uncertain. "Please, I need to get my hand off this thing." The guards exchanged glances, then one of them stepped forward. He was massive, even for an Ethorian, easily 7.5 feet tall with arms that looked like they could bend steel. He reached for Katie's wrist gently, carefully, trying not to hurt her. The moment his fingers touched her skin, the crown reacted. Energy pulsed outward from where Katie's hand contacted the metal. Not the violent explosion that had thrown Lord Gareth across the chamber. This was controlled. Measured. But absolutely firm. The guard was pushed backward smoothly, his feet sliding across the polished floor until he was a good 6 feet away from Katie. "I can't touch you, Sovereign-elect," the guard said, sounding shaken. "The crown won't allow it." "Don't call me that," Katie said, panic rising in her voice. "I'm not, this isn't, there's been a mistake." More people were flooding into the chamber now. The High Council members who'd rushed out when Lord Gareth was injured. Palace officials. More guards. Everyone drawn by the alarms and the light show that had just illuminated the entire building. They crowded the entrance, staring at the impossible scene before them. A human woman. Touching the crown. With the artifact glowing in acceptance after 6 months of darkness. Chancellor Vex pushed through the crowd with the authority of someone who'd been making people move out of his way for 4 centuries. He was tall like all Etherians, but age had bent his spine slightly. His skin had the faintly translucent quality that very old Etherians developed, almost like pale blue marble. His eyes were sharp despite his age, missing nothing as he approached the platform where Katie stood frozen. "Everyone else, stay back," Vex commanded. His voice carried natural authority that made even the nobles in the crowd stop their forward movement immediately. "Give the sovereign-elect space." "Please don't call me that," Katie repeated. Her voice cracked. She was on the edge of completely losing it. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. Vex climbed the steps to the platform carefully, his movements deliberate. He stopped a few feet from Katie, studying her face and then the crown she was touching. The glow where her hand made contact with the metal was unmistakable. Clear evidence of the bond. "Can you tell me what you're feeling?" Vex asked quietly. His tone was gentle, almost grandfatherly. "What sensations are you experiencing?" Katie tried to find words for something she had no reference for. "There's information flowing through my head. Like watching 100 screens at once. I can see, feel. I don't even know how to describe it. Networks. Systems. Distances. It's too much. It's overwhelming." "That's the Imperial Network," Vex said. "The Crown is giving you access to all the systems that connect the Empire. Can you sense the planetary shields?" Katie closed her eyes, trying to focus on the chaos of information flooding her mind. And yes, there it was. She could feel shield generators on dozens of worlds. Could sense their power levels, their operational status. Some were strong. Others were weak. One was flickering on the edge of failure. "Calleth Prime," Katie whispered, not knowing how she knew the planet's name. "The shield there is at 18%. It's going to fail completely in." She paused, accessing information she shouldn't have. 11 days. Vex's face went pale. "That information is classified. Kept secret to avoid panic. The only people who know about Calleth Prime are the High Council members." He looked at Katie with new understanding. New concern. "The Crown has bonded with you fully. You have complete access." "Unbond me," Katie demanded. "Please. There has to be a way to undo this. I didn't mean to touch it. I tripped. This was an accident." Vex's expression became grave. Sad even. "The Crown has bonded with you. You are now the sovereign-elect of the Ethorian Empire." Katie stared at him. The words weren't making sense. They were in a language she understood, but their meaning seemed impossible. "I'm sorry, what?" "The Crown has chosen you," Vex explained slowly, carefully. "If you accept this choice, you will become our ruler. You will have authority over all our systems. Control over our military. Responsibility for the welfare of billions of lives across hundreds of worlds spanning this entire region of space." "No." The word came out immediately, without thought. "No, that's not possible. I'm a junior diplomat. I'm 24 years old. I'm human. I don't even fully understand your culture. This is obviously a mistake. The Crown made an error." "The Crown doesn't make errors," Vex said firmly. "In 50,000 years, it has never chosen incorrectly. It has chosen you for reasons we don't understand, but it has chosen." Katie shook her head violently. "Then unchose me. Unbond us. Break whatever connection just formed. There has to be a way." Vex's expression became even more serious. "Once the Crown chooses, the choice is permanent. The bond cannot be broken except by death. Yours or the Crown's, and no one knows if the Crown can even die." He paused. "You have two options. You can accept the role and become sovereign. Or you can refuse." "I refuse," Katie said immediately. Relief flooded through her. There was an out. She could refuse this insanity and go back to her normal life. Back to her normal job. "I refuse. I'm not accepting this." "If you refuse," Vex continued, his voice heavy with regret, "the Crown will remain bonded to you but inactive. It won't grant you its full powers. Won't connect you fully to the Imperial systems. And the Empire will continue operating without a sovereign." Katie didn't see the problem. "Then that's what happens. You find another way to fix your systems. Hire engineers or programmers or whatever. Figure it out without me." "The Crown cannot choose another while bonded to you," Vex explained. "If you refuse to serve, the Crown will remain bound to you, inactive and useless, for as long as you live. Which means the Empire will continue to fail. The shields will keep dropping. The communications will keep degrading. The defense systems will keep going offline." He met her eyes directly. Millions will die. Eventually billions. All because the crown is bonded to someone who refuses to serve. The weight of his words hit Katie like a physical blow. You're saying if I don't accept, people die? Yes, Vex said simply. There was no judgment in his voice. No pressure. Just the statement of a terrible fact. Katie felt like she couldn't breathe. The chamber seemed to be spinning around her. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be her life. She'd come to Ethoria to observe diplomatic ceremonies. To write reports. To learn about alien cultures. She hadn't come here to be forced into ruling an empire. I need. Katie's voice shook. I need to talk to Ambassador Williams. My delegation. I need. Of course, Vex said. You'll be given time to decide. To consult with your people. To understand what's being asked of you. He gestured to the other council members. We'll convene the High Council and your human delegation. You'll have 24 hours to make your choice. 24 hours. Katie's laugh was slightly hysterical. You want me to decide whether to become an alien empress in 24 hours? The empire is failing, Vex said gently. Every hour without a sovereign brings us closer to catastrophic system failures. We would give you more time if we could. But we don't have more time to give. The next hour was a blur. Someone figured out that Katie could move if she kept her hand on the crown. A guard brought a wheeled platform. They carefully moved the crown's pedestal, with Katie's hand still attached, to a private chamber. The council and the human delegation were summoned immediately. Ambassador Williams arrived looking like someone had just told him the world was ending. Maybe it had. Dr. Hayes was with him, along with 2 other senior diplomats. They stared at Katie standing with her hand on the crown, the faint glow of the bond visible in the dim chamber lighting. Katie, Ambassador Williams said, his voice carefully controlled. Tell me exactly what happened. Katie explained. The trip. The fall. Her hand catching herself on the crown. The explosion of light and energy and information. The bond that wouldn't break. Williams listened with an expression that shifted from shock to disbelief to something that might have been horror. This is unprecedented, Williams said, pacing. Completely unprecedented. We need to contact Earth. Get guidance from the diplomatic corps. From the government. This has massive implications. Sir, I don't think we have time for that, Dr. Hayes interjected. They're giving her 24 hours to decide. 24 hours to decide whether to become the ruler of a multisystem empire. Williams's voice climbed higher. That's insane. We need weeks. Months. Time to analyze the political ramifications. The legal complications. The precedent this sets. The empire is failing, Chancellor Vex said from where he stood with the other council members. We don't have weeks. The room erupted into arguments. Williams insisted they needed more time. Vex explained again that the empire's systems were collapsing. Other council members jumped in with technical details about shield failures and communication breakdowns. The human diplomats tried to process information they had no framework for understanding. Katie stood in the middle of it all with her hand still on the crown, feeling the empire through the bond. She could sense the shield on Coloth Prime growing weaker. Could feel communication delays between distant worlds getting longer. Could sense the slow, steady collapse happening in real time. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. Stop. Everyone kept arguing. Nobody heard her. Stop. Katie's voice came out louder than she'd intended. Amplified somehow by the crown. The word echoed through the chamber like a physical force. Everyone fell silent. Stared at her. Katie took a shaky breath. Can everyone else leave except Ambassador Williams and Chancellor Vex? Please. I need to think and I can't do it with 20 people arguing. The room cleared reluctantly. Soon it was just Katie, Williams, and Vex. The silence felt heavy. Oppressive. Tell me honestly, Katie said to Vex. If I refuse this. If I say no and force you to find another solution. How many people will die before you figure something out? Vex didn't hesitate. Millions within 6 months. Tens of millions within a year. Eventually the empire will fragment. War will break out between systems competing for resources. The death toll will climb into the billions. Katie turned to Williams. Sir, what should I do? Williams looked at her for a long moment. She could see him struggling with the weight of the decision. Finally, he sighed. I can't tell you what to do, Katie. This is beyond any protocol we have. Beyond anything the human government has ever faced. He paused. But I can tell you that if you refuse, a lot of people will die. And you'll have to live with that knowledge. Katie felt tears forming. I'm 24. I don't know how to rule an empire. I'll fail. I'll make mistakes that kill people anyway. Probably, Vex said bluntly. Every ruler makes mistakes. But mistakes we can recover from. Complete system collapse, we cannot. Katie stood there with her hand on the crown, feeling the weight of billions of lives pressing down on her. Feeling the empire failing in real time through the bond. Knowing that if she walked away, all those people would suffer for her choice. She thought about her parents back on Earth. They taught her to help people when she could. To do the right thing even when it was hard. They'd be proud of her for considering this. Terrified, but proud. She thought about why she'd studied diplomacy in the first place. She'd wanted to make a difference. To help bridge gaps between species. To make the galaxy a little bit better. She just never imagined making a difference this big. If I do this, Katie said slowly, I'm going to need help. A lot of help. I don't know your laws. Your customs. Your history. I'll need advisors. Teachers. People willing to be patient with me while I learn. You'll have whatever you need, Vex promised. I'll personally serve as your primary advisor if you'll have me. Katie closed her eyes. Felt the crown's bond. Felt the empire waiting. Felt the weight of responsibility settling on her like physical chains she'd never be able to remove. I accept, Katie whispered. Then louder, I accept. I'll do it. The decision felt like stepping off a cliff with no idea where she'd land. But millions of lives were at stake. And somehow, for reasons she'd probably never understand, an ancient artifact thought she was the right person for this. Even if she was absolutely terrified. Even if she was convinced she'd fail. Even if she was just a 24-year-old human who'd gotten the job by literally tripping over her own feet. She'd try. She'd do her best. And hope that somehow, that would be enough. The coronation was scheduled for the next day. Katie had one night to say goodbye to the life she'd expected and prepare for the one she'd never imagined. One night before she became the first human empress of an alien empire. One night before everything changed forever. The coronation ceremony lasted 4 hours. 4 hours of rituals Katie didn't understand, speeches in languages she was still learning, and thousands of eyes watching her every move. When it finally ended and the crown was placed on her head, the energy that flowed through her was overwhelming. She nearly collapsed right there in front of everyone. Only the crown itself seemed to steady her, showing her how to manage the flood of information, how to breathe through the connection to billions of lives. Now, 1 week later, Katie sat in her new quarters in the Imperial Palace trying to process how completely her life had changed. The rooms were enormous. Designed for Etherians who averaged 8 feet tall, everything was scaled wrong for her 5'4" frame. The bed was massive, more like a small platform than a bed. She had to climb onto it. The chairs were too tall, leaving her feet dangling like a child's when she sat today. The doorways were so high she felt like she was walking through giant archways. The ceilings disappeared into darkness above her. The furniture was beautiful but alien. Made from materials she didn't recognize and styles that hurt her eyes if she looked at them too long. The colors were slightly wrong, shifted into spectrums that Ethorian eyes perceived differently than human ones. Everything about the space reminded her constantly that she didn't belong here. Staff had tried to adjust things for her. Brought in a human-sized chair. Lowered some of the light fixtures. Added a step stool beside the bed. But it still felt like living in a dollhouse built for giants. Like being a child playing dress-up in adult clothes that didn't fit. And everywhere she went, people bowed. Guards at the doors. Servants in the hallways. Officials she passed in the corridors. They'd stop what they were doing, turn toward her, and bow from the waist with their hands crossed over their chests in the formal Ethorian gesture of respect to the sovereign. Your Majesty, they'd murmur as she passed. Every single time, Katie wanted to tell them to stop. To explain that she was just Katie Brooks from Minnesota, not anyone worthy of bowing. But Chancellor Vex had explained that accepting the formal respect was part of the job. That refusing it would undermine her authority and confuse people about the chain of command. So Katie let them bow. Let them call her Your Majesty and Sovereign and Your Imperial Highness. But inside, she cringed every time. It felt like a joke. Like any moment someone would realize the mistake and send her back to her old job taking notes in the background of diplomatic meetings. The crown gave her access to everything. That was the promise and the curse. She could pull up data on any system in the Empire just by thinking about it. Could see real-time status reports from thousands of worlds. Could monitor communication traffic, defense grids, shield generators, trade routes. The amount of information available was staggering. But having access to information was completely different from knowing what to do with it. On her third day as sovereign, Katie had noticed that a labor dispute on an industrial world was causing production delays. Workers were protesting poor conditions. Factory owners were threatening to shut down operations. The previous emperor's note suggested sending in security forces to restore order. Katie, thinking about how labor disputes were handled on Earth, had issued a command for both sides to enter mandatory mediation instead. Had required factory owners to negotiate in good faith or face penalties. What she hadn't understood was that Ethorian labor law worked completely differently than human labor law. Her command had created a legal paradox that tied up the entire planetary court system. Production didn't just slow down. It stopped completely. Millions of workers were sent home with no pay pending resolution of the legal confusion Katie had accidentally created. Chancellor Vex had caught the problem within hours, but not before the damage was done. They'd had to reverse her command, issue clarifications, and essentially start over. The whole thing made Katie look incompetent. Like a child playing with controls she didn't understand. You couldn't have known, Vex had said kindly when Katie apologized for the third time. Ethorian labor law has evolved over 10,000 years. You've been studying it for 3 days. Mistakes are inevitable. But knowing mistakes were inevitable didn't make Katie feel better about making them. Especially when millions of people suffered the consequences. The diplomatic incident had been worse. An ambassador from a neighboring empire had requested a meeting. Katie, reading the briefing materials quickly, had thought it was a routine check-in. A courtesy call to acknowledge the new sovereign and maintain good relations. She dressed casually by Ethorian standards. Had been friendly and informal during the meeting. Had even made a joke about still learning the job. What Katie hadn't realized was that the ambassador's request for a meeting was actually a formal grievance. His empire was upset about a trade dispute that had been unresolved for months. By dressing casually and being informal, Katie had accidentally communicated that she didn't take their grievance seriously. That she was dismissing their concerns. The ambassador had left offended. His empire had lodged a formal protest. It took 3 days of careful diplomatic work by Vex and the rest of the council to smooth things over and explain that the new sovereign was still learning protocols. Katie had spent those 3 days studying diplomatic protocols until her eyes hurt. Learning which clothing styles meant what. Which forms of address were appropriate for which situations. How even the smallest details of a meeting setup communicated messages she hadn't intended to send. She was learning on the job with no training, no preparation, and the entire empire watching every move. It was exhausting. Terrifying. Like taking the most important test of her life, except she hadn't been given the textbook and the answers changed depending on context she didn't fully understand. At night, Katie would lie in her too large bed in her too tall room and wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake. If accepting the crown's choice had been the wrong decision. If someone else could do this job better. But then she'd feel through the crown's connection to the empire. Feel the shields that were slowly strengthening now that a sovereign was bonded. Feel the communication networks that were stabilizing. Feel the defense systems coming back online. The empire was healing. Because she'd accepted the responsibility even though she wasn't ready for it. Not everyone was grateful. Not everyone accepted her authority. Some actively worked against her. Lord Kale was the worst. He was an older Ethorian noble from one of the most prestigious families in the empire. He'd been a candidate himself during the early days of the selection process. Had approached the crown with absolute confidence that it would choose him. When it rejected him, he'd been humiliated in front of thousands of witnesses. Now a human held the position he'd believed was rightfully his. And Kale wasn't accepting it quietly. He spread rumors through the noble circles. Whispered that the crown had made an error. That proximity to a human had somehow confused its selection process. That Katie couldn't possibly understand Ethorian needs or culture. That her mistakes proved she was unworthy of the role. He was subtle about it. Never openly defying her in ways that could be punished. But he delayed implementing her orders in the territories his family controlled. Found reasons why her commands couldn't be carried out immediately. Questioned her decisions in council meetings in ways that seemed respectful on the surface but were clearly meant to undermine her confidence. Other nobles watched to see if Kale's rebellion would succeed. Some started finding their own subtle ways to resist Katie's authority. Testing her. Seeing how much they could get away with. Katie felt it through the crown. Could sense the resistance. The lack of unity. The fractures in the empire's leadership that her inexperience was creating. It made her doubt herself even more. Made her wonder if maybe Kale was right. Maybe she wasn't capable of this. But she had supporters too. Chancellor Vex never wavered. He spent hours each day teaching her. Explaining the nuances of Ethorian politics. Helping her understand the historical context of current situations. Being patient when she made mistakes and helping her fix them. He believed the Crown's choice was correct even if he didn't understand it yet. General Thane, the commander of the Imperial military, surprised Katie by supporting her too. He was a gruff, no-nonsense career soldier who'd served under 3 previous emperors. Katie had expected him to resent taking orders from a human barely older than his own grandchildren. Instead, Thane respected that she asked questions. That she admitted when she didn't know something instead of pretending. That she listened to advice and actually considered it before making decisions. The previous emperor stopped asking questions centuries ago, Thane had told her after one meeting. Started assuming he knew everything. That's when leaders become dangerous. You ask. You listen. That's worth more than experience. Some younger Etherians were excited by the change too. They saw Katie as proof that their society could evolve. That tradition wasn't the only way forward. They started calling themselves sovereignists and actively supported her reforms even when older generations resisted. Katie threw herself into learning everything she could. She studied Ethorian history for hours every day. Not just the major events, but the cultural context. Why certain traditions existed. How their values had formed over millennia. She learned their language properly, not just relying on the Crown's translation abilities. She wanted to understand the actual words people used. The nuances that translation missed. She met with representatives from different worlds across the Empire. Listened to their concerns. Their needs. Their frustrations with how things had always been done. She took notes constantly. Built mental maps of how different regions operated. Who the key players were. What issues mattered most to common citizens versus nobles. She approached being sovereign the same way she'd approached school. Methodically. Thoroughly. Asking every question that came to mind no matter how basic it seemed. Building her knowledge piece by piece. Accepting that she'd make mistakes but trying to learn from each one so she didn't repeat them. And slowly, very slowly, things started to click. She began understanding why certain protocols existed. Started recognizing patterns in how different regions responded to different types of commands. Learned to sense through the Crown when something she was considering would cause unintended problems. 3 months into her reign, Katie faced her first real test. A border system reported attacks. Ships were being hit by what looked like raiders. Citizens were scared. The local defense forces were requesting permission to engage with full military force. The previous emperor's protocols were clear: respond to threats with overwhelming strength. Send in the military. Eliminate the danger. Don't negotiate with criminals. Katie pulled up all the data she could access through the Crown. Studied the attack patterns. Read reports from the local system. Something felt wrong. The attacks weren't following normal raider tactics. The ships being hit were cargo vessels carrying food and medical supplies, but the attackers weren't stealing the cargo. They were taking it and leaving immediately. No demands. No ransoms. Just taking supplies and fleeing. These aren't raiders, Katie said during the emergency council meeting. Raiders take valuable cargo. Luxury goods. Technology. These attackers are only taking food and medicine. Does it matter? Lord Kale demanded. They are attacking our citizens. We respond with force. I want to try talking to them first, Katie said. The council erupted in protests. Talking to criminals? Showing weakness? This was exactly the kind of naive human thinking that proved she wasn't fit to rule. Katie held firm. Give me 72 hours. If talking doesn't work, we send the military. But I want to understand what's happening before we start shooting. She opened communication channels herself, using the Crown's abilities to broadcast across the border region. Took her 2 days to get a response. When it came, it wasn't from raiders. It was from refugees. Their home world had been destroyed in a natural disaster. They'd been traveling in a desperate fleet of damaged ships, running out of supplies, watching their people die. They tried asking for help but their communications were too damaged to send clear messages. In desperation, they'd started taking supplies from passing ships. Not from cruelty. From survival. Katie negotiated directly. Offered them asylum in the Empire. Arranged for proper aid shipments. Got them medical care and temporary housing on a border world that had space. The refugee fleet became allies instead of enemies. The crisis resolved without a single shot fired. Some nobles called it luck. Others called it weakness. But the citizens of the border system called it wisdom. And General Thane started looking at Katie with new respect. "You saw what others didn't," Thane told her privately. "You asked why instead of just reacting. That's the mark of a good leader." Katie was beginning to understand something important. Her human perspective wasn't a weakness. It was different. Etherians had thousands of years of traditions and assumptions. Sometimes those traditions were valuable. But sometimes they blinded people to alternatives. She could ask, "Why do we do it this way?" when everyone else just assumed the current way was the only way. She could question assumptions that seemed unquestionable to people raised in Etherian culture. She could bring fresh eyes to old problems. Maybe that's why the Crown chose her. Not despite being human, but because of it. The Crown itself was becoming easier to work with. Katie was learning to interpret its nudges. To understand the guidance it provided without letting it make all her decisions for her. It would suggest options during important choices. Highlight consequences she might not have considered. But it left the actual decision to her. The Crown didn't want a puppet. It wanted a partner. Katie's personal life was harder. She was isolated in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her old friends from the human delegation tried to maintain relationships, but it wasn't the same. She wasn't their colleague anymore. She was an empress. That changed everything. People couldn't relax around her. Couldn't joke with her the same way. The power dynamic made real friendship almost impossible. She missed her family desperately. Called her parents every week, but the conversations were awkward. "How do you explain to your teacher parents in Minnesota that you're now ruling an alien empire spanning hundreds of star systems?" They were proud. Supportive. But they didn't understand her life anymore. The gap felt unbridgeable. Her one genuine friendship was with her personal guard. A young Ethorian woman named Lissa who'd been assigned to protect Katie after the coronation. Lissa was in her 30s by Ethorian standards, which was young for her species. She was professional during official duties but relaxed when they were alone. They started talking during the long hours Katie spent working late. Lissa would bring her food when she forgot to eat. Would remind her to sleep when she was pushing too hard. Would make dry observations about palace politics that made Katie laugh. Slowly, carefully, they became friends. Real friends. Lissa treated Katie like a person instead of a position. They'd sit up late talking about their lives. Lissa teaching Katie about Ethorian culture from a common person's perspective instead of a noble's. Katie teaching Lissa about Earth and human customs. It was the most normal relationship Katie had, and she treasured it desperately. 6 months into her reign, Katie had stabilized most of the critical systems. Shields were back above 85% across the empire. Communication networks were running smoothly. Defense grids were operational. The immediate crisis that had led to her selection had passed. But Lord Kale hadn't given up. Katie could feel through the Crown that he was planning something bigger than just whispered rumors and delayed orders. He was gathering support among conservative nobles. Building a case. Preparing for a formal challenge. The test of her sovereignty was coming. And Katie wasn't sure she was ready for it. But ready or not, she'd face it. Because that's what the Crown had chosen her to do. Because millions of people were counting on her. Because she'd accepted this responsibility and she wouldn't abandon it just because it was hard. She was learning to rule an empire one mistake at a time. And somehow, impossibly, it was starting to work. Lord Kale had been busy. Katie knew this because she could sense activity through the Crown's connection to the empire's information networks. Documents being shared among certain noble houses. Private meetings in shielded rooms she couldn't monitor directly. Communications encrypted with old protocols designed to keep things hidden from the sovereign's awareness. He was building something. A case against her. And Katie could do nothing but watch it take shape and wait for him to make his move. The move came 7 months into her reign. Kale invoked an ancient law that Katie hadn't even known existed. The law of sovereign review. It was buried deep in Ethorian legal code, created thousands of years ago as a safeguard against rulers who became unfit for their position. The law stated that if a sovereign showed clear evidence of incompetence, if their decisions consistently harmed the empire, if they violated core traditions repeatedly, then the High Council could convene a formal review of sovereignty. The sovereign would be required to defend their reign. To prove their worthiness. To justify their continued rule. If the council found the sovereign unworthy, they could attempt to remove the crown. The process had only been invoked 3 times in 50,000 years of Ethorian history. Twice, the sovereign had been cleared. Once, the attempt to remove the crown had resulted in the sovereign's death and the crown's temporary dormancy while it healed from the trauma of forced separation. Kale knew all this. Knew that forcing the crown off Katie might damage it permanently. Might leave the empire without a sovereign for years or even decades while the artifact recovered. But he didn't care. In his mind, a damaged crown was better than a human empress who didn't understand Ethorian values. The summons came through official channels. Katie was in her quarters studying agricultural reports when Lissa brought her the formal document. The review of sovereignty would be held in the Grand Chamber in 3 days. Katie was required to attend and defend her rule before the 5 members of the High Council. Katie read the document 3 times, her hands shaking. This was it. The test she'd known was coming but had hoped to avoid. Everything she'd been working toward for 7 months would be judged. And she might be found wanting. Are you going to be okay? Lissa asked quietly. She dropped the formal guard demeanor. This was friend Lissa, not protector Lissa. I don't know, Katie admitted. Probably not. But I don't have a choice. I have to face this. The next 3 days were a blur of preparation. Chancellor Vex helped her gather evidence of her successful decisions. General Thane provided military assessments showing that her approaches had actually strengthened the Empire's security rather than weakening it. Representatives from worlds she'd helped sent testimonials about improved conditions under her rule. But Katie also reviewed all her mistakes. Every bad decision. Every time she'd misunderstood something crucial. Every moment where her inexperience had caused problems. Because Kale would have all of those documented. Would present them as proof that she wasn't fit to rule. The night before the review, Katie barely slept. She lay in her 2 large bed staring at the too high ceiling, feeling the weight of what was coming. The crown rested on a stand beside her bed, glowing faintly. She could feel its presence. Its support. But even the crown couldn't tell her if she'd be allowed to keep wearing it after tomorrow. The morning of the review arrived cold and gray. The weather on Ethoria's capital world matched Katie's mood perfectly. She dressed in formal robes, the official garments of the sovereign. Placed the crown on her head, feeling its familiar weight. Walked through the palace corridors with Lissa at her side and a full guard escort surrounding them. The grand chamber was packed. Not just with nobles this time. Kale had made sure the review was public. Broadcast across the entire empire. Millions would be watching. Maybe billions. All of them seeing Katie defend her right to rule. All of them judging whether a human empress was acceptable or if this had been a terrible mistake from the start. The 5 High Council members sat at an elevated platform at the chamber's far end. Chancellor Vex in the center. The other 4 on either side. Their faces were carefully neutral, showing no hint of which way they were leaning. Katie's chair was positioned in the center of the chamber floor. Alone. Exposed. Surrounded by galleries filled with witnesses. She sat down, trying not to show how nervous she was. The crown helped, providing a sense of calm through their bond. But her hand still shook slightly in her lap. Lord Kale stood to present his case. He was dressed in his finest formal attire, his family's colors displayed prominently. He looked confident. Certain he would win this. That by the end of the day, the human interloper would be removed and proper order would be restored. Honored Council, Kale began, his voice carrying across the chamber with practiced authority. I invoke the law of sovereign review not out of personal grievance, but out of concern for our empire's future. I present evidence that our current sovereign, despite the crown's initial selection, is unfit to rule. He activated holographic displays that appeared in the air above the chamber floor. Documents. Recordings. Reports. All of Katie's mistakes from her first 7 months compiled into a damning presentation. She has violated our traditions repeatedly, Kale continued, gesturing to examples. She negotiates with criminals instead of enforcing justice. She questions policies that have stood for millennia. She makes decisions based on alien values that have no place in Ethorian governance. He pulled up the labor dispute from Katie's 3rd day. Showed how her command had created legal chaos. How millions of workers had been sent home without pay because she didn't understand Ethorian labor law. He showed the diplomatic incident. Played recordings of the offended ambassador's complaints. Demonstrated how Katie's casual approach had nearly damaged relations with a neighboring empire. He went through a dozen more examples. Times Katie had hesitated when previous emperors would have acted immediately. Times she'd chosen unconventional solutions instead of following established protocols. Times her human perspective had led to outcomes that confused or upset Ethorian citizens. She is too young, Kale declared. Too inexperienced. Too alien to understand what this empire needs. The crown may have selected her, but the crown can make errors when confused by unfamiliar factors. Her presence near the crown during its vulnerable dormant state may have disrupted its selection process. This selection should be declared invalid, and the sovereign should be removed for the good of the empire. Kale sat down looking satisfied. His presentation had been thorough. Damning. Every mistake Katie had made laid out for the entire empire to see. The crowd murmured. Even some of Katie's supporters looked concerned. The evidence was overwhelming. Chancellor Vex looked at Katie. Sovereign Katie Brooks, you have heard the accusations against your rule. How do you respond? Katie stood. Her legs felt weak, but she forced them to hold her upright. She walked to the center of the floor where everyone could see her. Where every camera broadcasting across the empire was focused. She took a breath and began to speak. Everything Lord Kale said is true. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. That wasn't how you were supposed to start your defense. You were supposed to deny the accusations. Explain them away. Make excuses. Not admit to everything right at the start. Katie continued, her voice growing stronger. I have made mistakes. I issued a command about labor disputes that created legal chaos because I didn't understand how Ethorian labor law worked. I offended a diplomatic partner because I didn't know that clothing and formality levels communicate specific messages in your culture. I've hesitated when previous emperors wouldn't have because I don't have their experience or knowledge. She looked directly at the council members. I've questioned traditions that have stood for millennia because I don't have the cultural background to understand why they exist. I'm 24 years old. I'm human. I had absolutely no preparation for this role. Every single accusation Lord Kale made is accurate. The chamber fell silent. Even Kale looked confused. This wasn't going the way anyone expected. But, Katie continued, maybe that's exactly why the crown chose me. Maybe questioning traditions isn't weakness. Maybe bringing a different perspective isn't a flaw. Maybe not knowing the right way to do things means I can find better ways. She activated her own holographic displays. Started showing data. Here are the outcomes of my so-called mistakes. The labor dispute? After we fixed the legal issues, I worked with both sides to actually address the underlying problems. Worker safety has improved in that sector by 40%. Production is up 20% because workers aren't getting injured as often. That wouldn't have happened if I'd just followed the previous emperor's approach of sending in security forces. More data appeared. The diplomatic incident? Yes, I offended that ambassador initially. But after we smoothed things over, I negotiated a new trade agreement that benefits both empires more than the previous arrangement. The ambassador's government is now one of our strongest allies because I approached them as partners instead of subordinates. Katie pulled up the refugee crisis. These criminals I negotiated with? They were desperate refugees. Under the previous emperor's protocols, we would have destroyed their ships and killed thousands of innocent people. Instead, they are now citizens of the empire. Productive members of society. Grateful for being given a chance instead of being treated as enemies. She showed statistics on shield strength, communication reliability, defense grid functionality. All improving under her reign. System failures decreasing. Efficiency increasing. The empire wasn't just stable. It was actually functioning better than it had in the final years of Emperor Theron's rule. I make mistakes, Katie admitted. I'm learning as I go. But I learn from every mistake and don't repeat them. And my weakness of asking questions and trying to understand before acting? That's not weakness. That's wisdom. Previous emperors stopped questioning things. Started assuming they knew everything. That's when leaders become dangerous. She turned to face Lord Kale directly. You say I'm too alien to understand Ethorian needs. But maybe that's the point. Maybe you needed someone who could see your society from outside. Who could question assumptions you don't even realize you're making. Who could find solutions you'd never consider because you're too close to your own traditions. Katie looked back at the council. The crown didn't make a mistake. It chose differently. It chose someone who would bring change. Who would challenge the status quo. Who would ask why instead of just accepting because that's how we've always done it. That's not incompetence. That's evolution. Then something happened that no one expected. The crown on Katie's head began to glow brighter. Energy flowed from it, filling the chamber with light. But Katie wasn't controlling it. The crown was acting on its own. Images appeared in the air. Not words. Not data. Pure concepts. Emotions. Feelings communicated directly from the crown to everyone watching. The crown showed what it had sensed in Katie 7 months ago. Genuine care for others. Willingness to learn from mistakes. Humility to ask for help instead of pretending to know everything. Courage to do what was right even when terrified. These weren't Ethorian values or human values. They were universal qualities that made someone worthy of leading. The crown showed more. Revealed something that shocked even the council members. Emperor Theron had been failing in his final decades. He'd ruled for 300 years and had become rigid. Set in his ways. Stopped questioning his assumptions. Stopped growing. The empire had been stagnating under his leadership even though no one wanted to admit it. The crown had been searching for someone different. Someone who would bring change. Someone who would challenge traditions not out of disrespect but out of a genuine desire to make things better. Someone who would grow and evolve instead of becoming fixed in their thinking. It had rejected hundreds of Ethorian candidates not because they were unworthy, but because they would have continued the same patterns. The same approaches. The same slow stagnation. The empire didn't need more of the same. It needed something new. That's why the crown chose a human. Someone so different from previous emperors that she couldn't help but bring fresh perspectives. Someone young enough to still be learning and growing instead of assuming she had all the answers. Someone humble enough to admit mistakes and ask for guidance instead of pretending to be perfect. The crown's message was clear. Katie wasn't chosen despite being young, inexperienced, and human. She was chosen because of those qualities. Because they were exactly what the empire needed. The light faded. The images disappeared. The crown returned to its normal soft glow on Katie's head. The chamber was completely silent. Everyone had felt the crown's communication. Had understood what it was trying to tell them. Chancellor Vex stood. His ancient face showed wonder. In 50,000 years, the crown has never communicated so directly. Never explained its choices so clearly. He looked at Katie with new understanding. It chose you deliberately. Specifically. Not by accident or confusion, but with clear purpose. He turned to the other council members. We have heard Lord Kale's accusations. We have heard Sovereign Katie's defense. And we have heard from the crown itself. The council must now deliberate. The 5 council members withdrew to a private chamber to discuss. Katie was left sitting in her chair in the center of the grand chamber with thousands of eyes watching her. Waiting. The deliberation took 3 hours. 3 of the longest hours of Katie's life. Finally, the council returned. Vex spoke for them all. The council has reached a decision. We have carefully considered all evidence presented. We have weighed the accusations against the outcomes. We have listened to the crown's unprecedented communication. He paused. The council votes 4-1 to uphold Katie Brooks as sovereign of the Ethorian Empire. She has passed the review of sovereignty. Relief flooded through Katie so powerfully she almost cried right there in front of everyone. 4-1. Kale had lost. She was staying. The dissenting vote, someone in the crowd called out. Lord Kale, Vex said simply. Of course. Kale had been allowed to vote as the one who invoked the review. But even he couldn't deny that Katie's reign was working. That the empire was stronger under her leadership than it had been. That the crown's choice, however unexpected, had been correct. Kale stood, his face showing barely controlled anger. This is a mistake. The council is wrong. She will destroy everything we've built. No, Vex said firmly. She will help us build something better. And you, Lord Kale, are removed from council participation for the next year for attempting to undermine the sovereign without sufficient cause. This review was politically motivated, not genuinely concerned with the empire's welfare. Kale stormed out of the chamber. His supporters looked uncertain. Some followed him. Others stayed, reassessing their positions now that the council had spoken. The trial was over. Katie had won. But more than that, she'd been validated by the crown itself. By the empire's highest authority explicitly confirming that she belonged exactly where she was. The news spread across the empire within hours. The human empress who'd nearly been removed had been vindicated by the crown's own testimony. Support for her rule increased dramatically. Even previous opponents started reconsidering their positions. If the crown itself said she was the right choice, who were they to argue? Katie emerged from the review stronger than before. More confident. More certain of her place. She'd been tested and survived. Proven her worth not just to the council but to herself. She was still young. Still inexperienced. Still human ruling an alien empire. But she was also exactly what the Ethorian Empire needed. And now everyone knew it. The real work could begin. 5 years had passed since Katie Brooks accidentally touched the crown and changed her entire life. 5 years that felt like 50 sometimes. She was 29 years old now, but when she looked in the mirror, she saw someone much older staring back. The weight of responsibility had aged her in ways that weren't visible but were deeply felt. The crown connected her to billions of lives across hundreds of star systems. She could feel them through the bond that never truly turned off. Feel their suffering when disasters struck. Feel their joy when things went well. Feel their fears during conflicts. Feel their hopes for the future. It was like carrying the emotional weight of an entire civilization on her shoulders every moment of every day. Some nights, Katie would lie awake feeling a colony world struggling with drought. Or sensing tension between two systems disputing territory. Or experiencing the grief of a planet mourning after a mining accident killed hundreds. The crown let her feel all of it. Made her aware of problems across distances that human minds weren't designed to comprehend. It was exhausting. Draining in ways she couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't experienced it. She'd lost weight over the years despite the palace staff's best efforts to make sure she ate properly. Had developed stress lines around her eyes that made her look older than her years. Sometimes felt so tired she could barely function. But it was also meaningful in ways she'd never imagined. Every problem she helped solve. Every conflict she mediated. Every policy she implemented that improved lives. She could feel the impact through the crown's connection. Could sense the relief when she got things right. The gratitude. The hope that maybe things could actually get better. That feeling made all the exhaustion worthwhile. Made the sacrifice of a normal life seem like a fair trade. She was making a real difference on a scale most humans never dreamed of. That had to count for something. The Ethorian Empire had transformed under her rule. Not completely. You don't change thousands of years of culture and tradition overnight just because a new ruler has different ideas. But noticeably. In ways that mattered to millions of ordinary citizens whose voices had never been heard before. Katie had reformed the taxation system within her first year as sovereign. The old system had been in place for millennia, gradually evolving to benefit nobles and wealthy merchants while placing increasing burdens on common workers. It hadn't been designed maliciously. It had just developed that way over time as people with power shaped laws to benefit themselves. Katie had asked a simple question that apparently no previous emperor had thought to ask. Why do workers on agricultural worlds pay higher tax rates than nobles who own those worlds? The answer she'd gotten was basically, because that's how it's always been. Which wasn't an answer at all. So she changed it. Made the system more equitable. Progressive taxation based on actual ability to pay rather than social class. The nobles had complained loudly. Some had tried to fight the changes. But Katie had the crown's authority and she'd used it. The reforms passed. The result was that millions of common citizens suddenly had more money to spend on their families. To invest in their communities. To build better lives. And the empire's overall revenue had actually increased because a broader, more equitable tax base was more stable than one that relied on squeezing the poorest citizens. Education had been Katie's second major reform. On Earth, public education was considered a basic right in most countries. But in the Ethorian Empire, education beyond basic literacy was available only to those who could afford it. Most worlds had schools that taught children to read and do simple math. But higher education, scientific training, advanced skills, those were reserved for families with money. Katie had found this incomprehensible. How do you find your best scientists if you're only educating 10% of your population? She'd asked the council. The talented individuals rise regardless, one council member had explained. No they don't, Katie had argued. Talented people without access to education just stay in whatever jobs they were born into. You're wasting the potential of 90% of your citizens. She'd established universal education programs across the empire. Free access to schooling through advanced levels for anyone who wanted it. Funded by the reformed tax system. The nobles had complained about that too. But teachers had celebrated. Parents had wept with gratitude. Children on worlds where advanced education had been impossible suddenly had opportunities their parents never dreamed of. 5 years later, the first generation of universally educated students was entering the workforce. Entering universities. Entering fields that had previously been closed to them. The long-term impact was still unfolding, but early results suggested Katie had been right. The empire had been wasting enormous amounts of talent by limiting education to the wealthy. She'd created new ways for common citizens to petition the throne directly. Before Katie, if you had a problem or concern, you had to go through noble intermediaries. through layers of bureaucracy that filtered everything before it reached the emperor. Most issues never made it past local nobles who had no interest in forwarding complaints that might make them look bad. Katie had established digital petition systems that bypassed the nobles entirely. Citizens could submit issues directly to the sovereign's office. Obviously, Katie couldn't personally review millions of petitions. But she created teams to review them, identify patterns, and bring important issues to her attention. The result was that Katie learned about problems previous emperors never knew existed. She discovered corruption in remote systems that local nobles had been hiding for decades. Found out about infrastructure failures that hadn't been reported because regional administrators didn't want to admit they'd been negligent. Heard directly from citizens about what actually mattered to them rather than filtering everything through nobles who had their own agendas. The nobles hated this. Hated that their monopoly on access to power had been broken. Hated that Katie listened to common voices as much as aristocratic ones. They complained constantly about the breakdown of proper hierarchies. About how the throne was cheapening itself by entertaining petitions from farmers and factory workers. But the common people loved Katie for it. Loved that someone in power actually seemed to care what they thought. Actually tried to understand their problems instead of just assuming nobles spoke for everyone. Katie's approval ratings among common citizens across the empire were above 80%. Among nobles, below 30%. She was fine with that ratio. Worker protections had been another major reform. Ethorian labor law had been designed primarily to benefit employers. Workers had few rights. Could be dismissed without cause. Had no guaranteed safety standards. No limits on working hours. No protections against exploitation. Katie, coming from Earth where labor rights had been fought for over centuries, the Ethorian system appalling. She'd strengthened protections gradually over 5 years. Established safety requirements. Created processes for workers to report violations without fear of retaliation. Set reasonable limits on working hours and required rest periods. Employers had screamed that these reforms would destroy the economy. That productivity would collapse. That businesses couldn't function with such restrictions. Katie had listened politely and implemented the reforms anyway. Productivity had actually increased. Turns out workers who weren't exhausted and injured performed better than those who were being exploited. Who knew? But implementing reforms had required constant battles with conservative factions who wanted everything to stay exactly as it had always been. Required using her authority as sovereign to override resistance from entrenched power structures. Required being willing to be unpopular with people who'd held power for generations and didn't want to give up any of it. Lord Kale had never accepted defeat after the review of sovereignty. He'd continued opposing Katie's rule through passive resistance and political maneuvering for another 2 years. But eventually, even he'd been forced to admit she wasn't going anywhere. The crown's bond was permanent. Her reign was working. His opposition was accomplishing nothing except making him look increasingly irrelevant. 3 years ago, Kale had retired from politics entirely. Left the capital. Returned to his family's estates on their home world. He was an old man now by Ethorian standards, nearly 500 years old. He'd spent his last political efforts fighting against change and had lost completely. Katie almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Most organized opposition had faded. Individual nobles still grumbled about Katie's reforms. Still resented a human empress. Still wished things would go back to how they'd always been. But they'd stopped actively fighting. Had accepted that Katie was sovereign and that reality wasn't changing anytime soon. Because Katie had proven herself too many times to deny anymore. Every crisis she'd handled effectively. Every reform that had actually worked. Every time she'd made a decision that turned out better than the traditional approach would have. The evidence was overwhelming. Her reign wasn't just functional. It was good for the empire. The empire was stable. More stable than it had been in the final decades of Emperor Theron's rule. The economy was growing. Infrastructure was improving. Education was expanding. Worker conditions were getting better. Crime rates were decreasing. Diplomatic relations with neighboring powers were stronger. By every measurable metric, the Ethorian Empire was more prosperous and secure under Katie's leadership than it had been under her predecessor. Even nobles who hated her personally had to admit the numbers didn't lie. But Katie's personal life had paid a heavy price for her success. She'd never married. Had never even come close. A few relationships had started over the years but none had survived the pressures of her role. How do you have a normal relationship when you're an empress? When you can never fully separate your personal life from your responsibilities. When the person you're dating becomes automatically political whether they want to be or not. One relationship had lasted almost a year. A diplomatic liaison from a neutral human colony who understood the pressures Katie faced because he worked in similar circles. They'd been good together. Compatible. She thought maybe it could work. But eventually, he'd asked her to step down. To find a way out of being sovereign. To choose him and a normal life over the empire. When she'd explained that the crown's bond was permanent, that she literally couldn't stop being sovereign unless she died, he'd left. Said he couldn't spend his life competing with an empire for her attention. Katie hadn't tried dating seriously since then. It hurt too much. Required vulnerability she couldn't afford to show. Created complications her life was already too full of. Being sovereign meant being alone in ways that no one who hadn't experienced it could truly understand. She still missed Earth. Desperately. Missed the simplicity of her old life when the biggest decision she faced was what to order for lunch. Missed her parents. Missed her friends. Missed being able to walk down a street without guards following her. Missed anonymity. Missed normalcy. She visited Earth when she could. Maybe twice a year for a few days at a time. But it wasn't home anymore. Couldn't be. Too much had changed. She'd changed too much. The gap between her life and her family's lives had grown too wide to bridge. Her parents were proud of her. Told everyone their daughter was the empress of an alien empire. But they didn't really understand what that meant. Didn't grasp the weight of what she carried. How could they? They'd spent their lives as teachers in Minnesota. Katie now ruled systems spanning hundreds of light years. The disconnect was too vast for real understanding. Her one genuine close relationship was still with Lissa. Her personal guard had been promoted to captain of the Imperial Guard 3 years ago. But they'd stayed friends despite the widening gap in their official positions. Lissa was one of the few people who could still make Katie laugh. Who still treated her like a person instead of a position. They'd spend late nights talking when Katie couldn't sleep. When the weight of feeling billions of lives through the crown was too overwhelming. Lissa would bring tea and sit with her and just be present. Sometimes they'd talk about serious things. Sometimes about nothing important. Sometimes they'd just sit in comfortable silence. Those quiet moments of genuine connection kept Katie sane when nothing else could. But even that friendship was complicated by their roles. Lissa was Katie's subordinate now. A military officer who took orders from the sovereign. They could never be completely equal. The power dynamic would always be there, creating subtle distance no matter how much they both pretended it didn't. Katie was lonely in a palace full of people. Powerful in ways most humans never experienced but isolated by that same power. Respected by millions who'd never meet her but known truly by almost no one. It was the cost of the crown. The price of accepting a responsibility she'd never asked for. But she'd do it all again. Would make the same choice. Because the alternative was letting millions die while she prioritized her own comfort. And Katie couldn't live with that choice. Never could. Never would. 5 years into her reign, Katie had become the ruler the crown believed she could be. Not perfect. Still making mistakes. Still learning. But effective. Successful. Genuinely making the empire better than it had been. And then came the Karath. The Karath were an aggressive species from a neighboring region of space. Highly militarized. Expansionist. They'd been pushing into Ethorian territory for months, taking over systems at the empire's edges. Small conflicts at first. A disputed mining colony. A contested trade route. But escalating. Getting bolder. Taking more. Previous Ethorian policy would have been simple: respond with overwhelming military force. Send the fleet. Establish dominance. Push the Karath back and make it clear that invading Ethorian space was a mistake. General Thane brought Katie the military response plans. 3 battle fleets. Full mobilization. Strike hard and fast. Show strength. It was the traditional Ethorian approach. What every previous emperor would have done without hesitation. Katie studied the plans. Felt through the crown the tensions building at the empire's borders. The Karath were testing Ethorian resolve. Pushing to see how far they could go before facing consequences. A military response would stop them. Would restore the borders. Would prove that the empire was still strong. But it would also start a war. Kill thousands, maybe millions. Create lasting hostility between two civilizations. Lock both sides into cycles of retaliation and conflict. Make peace nearly impossible for generations. Before we start shooting, Katie said to General Thane, I want to understand why they're expanding. What do they want? Thane looked puzzled. Territory. Resources. The usual reasons for military expansion. But why now? Katie pressed. What changed? What's driving this? She used the Crown's capabilities to access intelligence reports. Studied Karath space as much as she could see from outside their borders. Ran analyses on their expansion patterns. And she found something that made her pause. The Karath homeworlds were dying. Environmental collapse from centuries of industrial exploitation. Their planets were becoming uninhabitable. They needed new worlds desperately. Not from greed or ambition. From survival. They were expanding because their species was slowly suffocating on their own polluted worlds. They needed space to relocate their populations. And they were taking it by force because they were desperate and saw no other option. I want to try something different, Katie told the council during an emergency meeting. I want to offer them an alternative to war. The council erupted in protests. You don't negotiate with invaders. You don't show weakness. This was exactly the kind of naive human thinking that proved Katie didn't understand how galactic politics worked. Katie listened to the objections. Then she explained her idea. Shared colony worlds. The Ethorian Empire had dozens of habitable planets that were only partially settled. Huge amounts of empty territory. Room for billions more people. What if instead of fighting over limited space, they shared what both sides had? They'll see it as weakness, one council member argued. They'll take advantage. Expand even more. Maybe, Katie admitted. But maybe they'll see it as a solution to their actual problem. And if they refuse, if they keep invading anyway, then we respond with military force. But I want to try diplomacy first. She staked her reputation on the Karath negotiations. Sent a diplomatic mission. Offered to meet with their leaders directly through the Crown's communication abilities. Proposed a treaty that would give them access to worlds they needed in exchange for peace and cooperation. Many advisors thought she was making a huge mistake. That the Karath would interpret the offer as weakness. That they'd demand more. That she was inviting disaster. But the Karath surprised everyone. They accepted. Their leaders explained that they'd been invading out of desperation. They knew war with the Ethorian Empire would cost them dearly even if they won. But they'd been out of options. Their people were dying. They'd been willing to accept huge casualties if it meant saving their civilization. Katie's offer gave them another choice. A way to save their people without war. Access to the space they needed without the devastating cost of conflict. They'd take partnership over conquest any day if it was actually on the table. The treaty Katie negotiated became known as the Karath Accord. It established shared colonies. Technology exchange between the two civilizations. Joint defense agreements. The Karath became allies instead of enemies. Two species that should have been at war instead became partners. The galaxy took notice. This wasn't how things usually worked. Empires didn't share territory with aggressive neighbors. They fought. Established dominance. Defended borders. Katie's approach was unprecedented. Radical. And it had actually worked. Other species started reconsidering their own assumptions about conflict and cooperation. The Ethorian model under human leadership was proving that there were alternatives to the traditional power dynamics that had governed galactic politics for millennia. Katie was invited to address the Galactic Council. The loose organization of major powers that coordinated on issues affecting multiple civilizations. It was considered a huge honor. A recognition that the Ethorian Empire and its human sovereign were forces that mattered on the galactic stage. Katie stood before representatives from dozens of species and talked about her experience. About being an outsider to Ethorian culture. About how that outside perspective had let her see solutions that insiders missed. About how diversity of thought made civilization stronger. About how the qualities that made good leaders, compassion and wisdom and willingness to learn, transcended species. I'm human, Katie said to the assembled representatives. I didn't grow up in your cultures. I don't have your history. I asked questions that seemed obvious to me but revolutionary to Etherians because I wasn't limited by their assumptions. She paused. Maybe that's something to consider. Maybe the outsider's voice, the different perspective, has value specifically because it's different. The speech was well received. Quoted in diplomatic circles across the galaxy. Used in universities to teach about cross-cultural leadership. Katie had become a symbol of something larger than just her own reign. A proof that worthiness wasn't determined by species or tradition but by character and vision. 5 years into her reign, people started asking about succession. Katie was still young by human standards. But she'd been connected to the crown for 5 years now. Living with the constant weight of billions of lives pressing on her consciousness. The role was aging her faster than normal. Already she could feel it taking a toll. What would happen when she died? The crown would need a new sovereign. Would it choose another Ethorian? Or might it choose someone from another species again? The Empire needed to prepare for that possibility. Katie established an academy. A training ground for potential future sovereigns from any species. Not to force the crown's choice. You couldn't do that. But to ensure that if the crown chose another non-Ethorian, the Empire would be ready. That the transition would be smooth. That her reign wouldn't be seen as a one-time anomaly but as the beginning of a new era where leadership could come from anywhere. The Academy accepted students from across the galaxy. Taught them about Ethorian culture and law. About imperial management and diplomacy. About the skills needed to potentially rule. Most of them would never be chosen by the crown. But they'd go back to their home worlds as trained administrators. As people who understood that different perspectives had value. As bridges between cultures. It was Katie's way of ensuring her legacy would outlast her. That the changes she'd made wouldn't be reversed the moment she was gone. That the Empire would continue evolving instead of snapping back to old patterns. A group of young humans visited Ethoria as part of a cultural exchange program. Katie met with them personally. Among the group was a teenage girl named Jessica who reminded Katie painfully of herself at that age. Curious. Idealistic. Full of questions about everything. Eager to make the world better somehow. Katie spent an afternoon with her. Showed her the palace. Explained what being sovereign actually meant beyond the fancy titles and ceremonies. Talked honestly about the costs and the rewards. The isolation and the meaning. Do you regret it? Jessica asked. Accepting the crown? Katie thought about the question seriously. Sometimes. When I'm exhausted and lonely and feeling like I'm failing. But mostly no. I've made a real difference. Helped millions of people live better lives. That's worth the cost. What advice would you give someone who wants to make a difference? Jessica asked. Opportunities come from unexpected places, Katie said. Sometimes the most important moments of your life happen by accident. When they do, be brave enough to say yes even when you're terrified. Worthiness isn't about being prepared or having the right background. It's about being willing to try. To learn. To care about others more than yourself. Jessica left looking thoughtful. Inspired. Like maybe she could do important things too. Katie hoped she could. Hoped this next generation would be even braver than hers had been. That night, Katie stood alone in the crown chamber. The same room where she tripped and accidentally changed her entire life 5 years ago. She reflected on everything that had happened. On how a clumsy accident had led to all of this. She still didn't fully understand why the crown chose her. Probably never would. But she'd grown into the role. Had become the leader the crown believed she could be. Had proven that an unlikely choice could be the right one. The crown glowed softly on her head. She could feel its presence. Its satisfaction maybe. The bond between them was complete now. Comfortable. Like it had always been there. Katie smiled despite her exhaustion. Despite the loneliness. Despite the weight that never really lifted. She'd done what she set out to do. Made the Empire better. Proved that change was possible. Shown that worthiness transcended species. A human girl had stumbled into ruling an alien empire. And somehow, impossibly, it had worked. That was legacy enough.